First of all, a big thank you to Bertrand, to Julien for having such a strong German presence and inviting such a strong German presence in this event. I very much agree that the collaboration between institutions and researchers and industry between France and Germany can really follow that very well-established principle that if France and Germany do something together, it tends to be quite easy to bring the rest of Europe along and to kind of be the engine for European progress. I want to talk about how standardization brings AI ethics into practice. And I should probably kick off with one or two remarks on, well, what's VDE got to do with it? And what is VDE anyway? So we're an old organization, so that's not a typo. It is 1893 that we were established at a time when it wasn't digitalization that was the new technology or AI, but it was electricity. But discussions around safety, around interoperability were just as pertinent then as they are for AI today. We are the largest engineering association in the EU, and we are very typically a bridge builder between academic research and industrial application. We also play a strong role in standardization. We are the German footprint of Senelec and IEC. And we have a testing institute that certifies for things like functional safety, security, and other desirable characteristics. And as far as AI ethics is concerned, we've actually got a fairly broad track record, both in standardization at the national level, at the European and the international level, but also as far as applied research, as far as bringing together the right people to bring forward the issue of AI ethics. And we're also active in the OECD, in the Council of Europe, and in very close cooperation with the European Commission. And I should conclude this introductory block with a note on our work on AI quality. So a lot has been said already this morning about the challenges of AI quality. In particular, Philippe Sluzalek has given this broad overview, and we are in the process of creating an AI quality and testing hub that doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, but bring together various initiatives. And first step towards that is an AI quality summit. Just a few weeks from now, on the 2nd of November in Frankfurt, there's a registration link here. It'll reappear on the very last slide. And of course, you're very, very welcome to register there and come to Frankfurt. And it's free as well. So what is the big challenge? The challenge is not to talk about the importance of principles such as transparency or explainability or accountability. The big challenge is to operationalize AI ethics and to do so with an approach that is viable for industry, who have to do it in practical terms, that is viable for regulators in terms of, yes, let's make it enforceable, and that is also viable for individuals, be it in their role as consumers of AI products, or be it in their role as citizens who are being affected by AI and who want to shape the digital space that they live in. And I've got a second bullet point here, very deliberately. This approach also has to make ethics measurable and enforceable. And the previous speaker already made a bit of a question mark over, well, to what extent can we measure it? But we have to measure it to some extent, otherwise it isn't really enforceable at all. Now, I kind of gave away one of the key points or the key arguments in the title slide, that connection between standardization and AI ethics or AI trustworthiness. Why is that? It's not really intuitive. What is special about standardization? Well, if you abstract away all the organizations and the processes, at its core, standardization is firstly consensus building. Standardization means that I build consensus painstakingly among all relevant stakeholders. And that's not just engineers, it's not just companies, it's all relevant stakeholders. And in fact, within the structures of standardization that I work in, for example, chairing the JTC 21 for European AI standardization, we are obliged to bring in the voices of consumers, of trade unions, of small businesses, of whatever other stakeholders are really affected, and build consensus among all of them. And the second thing that standardization is formulating this consensus in a concrete, in a specific, in a practically useful way. So that a programmer that trains an AI system for an autonomous train or an autonomous car really knows, well, what does it actually mean if this system is supposed to be transparent and explainable and fair? I need something concrete. I need something that I can use as a guideline. And that is the other thing that standardization does, the formulation of that consensus. And if we talk about AI ethics, well, that's exactly what we need. We need a broad societal discussion and consensus as far as possible. And we need to write down that consensus in such a way that AI developers can do something with it. And that led us 3 years ago to the conclusion that standardization is the right tool set to bring AI ethics and trustworthiness into practice. So, how do we go about that? You might think, well, let's take the easy route. Let's just standardize explicit ethical rules. So we could write into the standard, oh, a child is more important than an old person in a crash situation, or it's better to have 100 severely injured than one dead, maybe if an autonomous train does an emergency brake or not, or whatever. You could do that, but the problem is you're never going to capture all the rules, and you're never going to get consensus. I'm very, very sure, not even in this room, let alone in one country, and even less so globally, would we ever get consensus on what those rules should be. So, we could take the other extreme. We could say, well, let's keep the whole issue of ethics in itself out of the standard. And all that we standardize are the processes and the structures to reach those decisions. So, let's say we have an ethics committee and it has to consider issues in a certain way, and it has to document its discussions in a certain way. This is not unusual in standardization. Most of you here will be familiar with the ISO 9001 standard for quality, but lots of companies carry proudly or with some moans about the overhead involved, but most companies say, yep, we are ISO 9001 certified. The standard does not tell you what quality is. All it does is it tells you, create these structures, follow these processes, keep this documentation, and then we just assume quality will come out of it. We could do that for ethics as well. The downside is it means that critical decisions, sensitive decisions, are taken in some committees inside companies, and it's also relatively easy to work around or to evade, to maybe follow the letter of the standard but not the spirit. So it's okay as an approach, but limited on its own. And as you can guess, there's a gap in the middle. That's the solution that we've been following, or the approach that we've been following. We said, well, how about we take a leaf out of something that has been very, very successful in the past, the energy efficiency label. So anytime you buy a fridge, or you buy a dishwasher, or a car, or a Hoover, it tells you in the same kind of label what the energy consumption is. And it doesn't give you kilowatt hours, it gives you a range from A to G. And we can do the same with AI systems, with the ethically relevant characteristics of an AI system. A range for privacy from A to G, a range for transparency for A to G, a range for fairness from A to G, and so on. So we built a standardized description of ethical aspects of AI systems. And then we reach a label or a short data sheet like this one. So we explored this approach in 2019, 2020 in a research project that you can see on the right-hand side with a number of academic and civil society institutions. And we also trialed it in discussions both at the European level in the AI focus group and at the international level at the IC. And the interesting twist at the international level, I was chairing the group in a dual chairpersonship with a Chinese colleague, and we did actually reach very quickly consensus on this because we're talking about the description of the system, not about the judgment. And it turned out, yes, that is a viable approach. And so we took the next step. We built a consortium of industry together with academia again and civil society perspectives. And we created a consortial standard that we published in April 2022, this year. And it fully describes an AI product with regards to 5 dimensions. So, of course, we made sure that this is not just something that is good to differentiate a product in the marketplace, but we also construct it in a way that makes it already consistent with the current draft of the AI Act. Because from a company perspective, it's nice to do things only once. So, a couple of questions arise if we take this approach. First question is, well, which categories do we include? Why transparency, accountability, privacy, fairness, and reliability? Why not 5 others? That's a relatively straightforward answer. There are a whole raft of meta-analyses around that review the various principal papers that are around by the likes of UNESCO, OECD, the G7. Lots of organizations have published papers. The European high-level expert group was mentioned just now, have created papers on what principles of ethical or trustworthy AI should be. And you do a meta-analysis and you realize that those papers more or less say the same thing. And it's really relatively straightforward to go from the top, deduplicate a little bit, and you get more or less to this list. We did have some discussions whether to include environmental sustainability as well. We decided not to do it at the top level, but that was just a decision on the breadth or the scope of that approach. Second question. Well, if you have those items here, how do you measure them? How do you measure transparency or accountability? Here, we took an approach that has been around in technology philosophy for 20, 25 years. It's basically, it's got a fancy name, but basically it's just a tree structure. So for each of those values, you have a layer of criteria. For transparency, it would be the disclosure of the data sets, disclosures about the model, whether the data that is being made available is actually understandable, to whom it is available, and so on. And for each of those criteria, you have a number of indicators, you have a number of questions, basically. And the important thing is that those questions don't just have a yes-no answer. That is too crude. They do have a range of answers from a very strong yes to a very strong no with clearly defined and question-specific levels in between. And that was actually the main part of the work that we did in this consortium, the consensus that we had to build in this consortium to come up with those potential answers and the questions to go with them. So a lot of work hidden behind this slide if you imagine going through all those 5 values and you have around 100 questions underneath. And the other thing that we needed was to aggregate back up. So if we have answers to those individual indicators, we have to aggregate back up and come to, for example, the conclusion that, well, a particular AI system is a transparency level C. We used some averaging, here shown as score indicators. We used negative and positive anchor indicators. I'm not going to go into the details here, but again, that was a relatively substantial amount of work. And then the third question that arises is, well, what levels are acceptable in a given application? Is privacy B good enough? Is privacy D or E good enough? And we take a very easy answer here. That didn't take us any time at all, because that's not the scope of the standard. That is the political decision. So with this standard, with this label, we make it possible for regulators across the world to make specific individual decisions. So a regulator in Canada could say, well, for face recognition in entry systems in buildings, we'd like to see at least privacy level B, we'd like to see at least fairness level A, and we'd like to see at least robustness level E, for example. And other countries might take different decisions. So we really separate the judgment of what is acceptable from the description of the system. And that has been a key, an absolute key for the success of that approach. And finally, a quick note on what does it mean from a company perspective. Not going to go into the details, but obviously companies that want to put this kind of label onto their products, that want to follow the standard, they can either go the route of a self-declaration, or if they want to sell their products for very sensitive applications, or it's a high-risk application as defined by the European AI Act, they might need to go through the external audit or the certification route. And I've shown a few certification institutions here. Of course, those could also be French institutions or institutions from other countries. Where do we go from here? And this is my final slide that also leads over to the next part of the agenda. Within the consortium where we built the trust standard and label, we very much had a focus on the metrics, on how to measure. In parallel, there's a lot of work going on in France around Confiance.ai on how to get better, on the tools, on the governance. And those approaches fit perfectly like a hand in a glove. They fit perfectly together. And this is one of the reasons that motivated Julien, Bertrand, myself, and others to look for ways of collaborating and seeing the potential synergies for collaboration. And together, we will take the step towards bringing those approaches, combining them, and bringing them into European standardization and regulation. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Sebastian, for this very clear and very motivating presentation. You already gave a presentation for an internal meeting of Confiance.ai, and I think this was the way for us to say we really have to work with you. So let's hope we'll do it in the future. So before we go to this signature, is there any question in the audience? Yeah, there is one at least there that I see. I have to come. Please come back. Come also.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was deeply interested in what you just presented. It seems to me that it is inspired by the risk analysis community. This community usually include some risk perception coefficient to set the level of risk acceptation. Have you heard about that kind of work? And if yes, do you plan to include risk perception and a risk representation in the decision? Thank you.
It's a very good question, and it really touches on that separation that I mentioned earlier. We try to keep apart the description of ethically relevant characteristics from the application context and the decision what is acceptable. And in our perspective, the description of risk or the assessment of risk is very much something that belongs into the application context. So in the research project I mentioned earlier, we actually also had an element that looked at how do you how can you do a risk classification. It was kind of superseded now by the European AI Act, because whether you like it or not, those are the 4 levels that we're going to work with. But again, those will need standards to clarify what is actually meant by those 4 levels. And within JTC 21, where we currently develop the standards to underpin the AI Act, there's also one group and one activity that looks at the kind of how to describe risk and how to pin down how risky an application actually is. It is a big problem that there's not just one but several risk management communities or risk management philosophies. There's even competing definitions of risk. And this is also a hot topic right now. It's being discussed in Sensenlec, it's being discussed in the OECD. I'm kind of co-chairing the risk assessment activity there, and we don't yet know how to approach it. But somehow we have to, well, we won't be able to to consolidate all the risk approaches because there are too many and too many different interests, but at the very least we need to have a mapping between those. That's kind of the minimum level that we're trying to reach.